The air inside the small law office felt heavy, as if even the walls were aware of the tension. Outside, autumn leaves swirled through the streets of Cedar Rapids, brushing against the windows before disappearing into the gray afternoon light. Inside, 3 people sat before the oak desk of Attorney Martin Shaw, and only one of them looked defeated. Grace Bennett sat motionless, her hands clasped together, eyes fixed on the floor. She already knew what was coming. Her husband, Ryan, had that look again, smug, self-satisfied, the same look he wore every time he thought he'd won. And beside him, Amber, his mistress, leaned back in her chair, legs crossed, smiling as if the outcome were a formality. Martin cleared his throat. As stipulated in the last will and testament of the late Eleanor Bennett, he began adjusting his glasses. The entirety of Mrs. Bennett's estate, including the residence on Hawthorne Street, the family savings account, and the Bennett Carpet Workshop, shall be transferred to her son, Ryan Bennett. Ryan's smirk widened. Grace didn't move. The lawyer hesitated before continuing. Additionally, there is a sealed letter addressed to Grace Bennett to be delivered upon the reading of this will. Amber snorted quietly, whispering something to Ryan. He chuckled. A letter? That's generous, he said under his breath, loud enough for Grace to hear. Martin's eyes flicked toward him, displeased, but said nothing. Grace reached out for the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. It was ivory paper, her name written in Eleanor's careful handwriting, the same handwriting that once left little notes beside morning tea. For a second, the sound of the lawyer's voice faded, and all she could hear was Eleanor's laugh echoing from memory. Ryan stood up. Well, that settles it then, he said briskly, buttoning his coat. We'll handle the property transfer with your office, Mr. Shaw. And Grace, he gave a mocking smile. I'm sure you'll land on your feet somehow. Amber's laughter followed him as they walked out together. The echo of the door closing was sharp, final. Grace sat still. Martin waited in silence, giving her time. When she finally stood, her voice was barely audible. She really left nothing else. He shook his head softly. Only that letter. Mrs. Bennett was very specific about it. Grace nodded. She didn't cry. Not here. She thanked him, tucked the letter into her coat, and stepped outside. The sky was bruised with clouds, the smell of rain close. Cars passed, a dog barked somewhere in the distance, and the world went on, indifferent to her humiliation. At the corner of the street, she stopped under the awning of a cafe and finally opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper, slightly yellowed, and the familiar scent of lavender Eleanor always wore. The handwriting was shaky but clear. My dear Grace, it began, if you are reading this, then I am no longer there to stand beside you. Please don't be afraid. I have made sure that you and little Liam will be safe. What's written here will guide you, but keep it to yourself until the time is right. Grace's eyes filled, but no tears fell. The words felt alive, as though Eleanor were still speaking from somewhere beyond the gray clouds above. She folded the letter back carefully, pressed it to her chest, and whispered, I'll follow your words, Eleanor. I promise. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Grace turned toward the empty street. Behind her, the lawyer's office light dimmed. Ahead of her, something unseen, not hope yet, but the first faint trace of it, waited quietly beyond the storm. Grace sat at the small kitchen table, the house quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock. Outside, rain slid down the window panes in steady lines, blurring the world into soft gray. The letter lay open before her, the paper already creased from how tightly she'd held it. She read the first paragraph again, afraid she had imagined it. I've paid off the mortgage in full, Eleanor had written. Quietly, so Ryan wouldn't know. The deed and proof of payment are held at Martin Shaw's office under your name. When the time comes, he will provide everything you need. Keep this to yourself until the divorce is final. Grace's breath caught. Her pulse thudded in her ears. It felt impossible. Eleanor, the woman Ryan had always dismissed as old-fashioned and controlling, had been protecting her all along. She read further. You must be strong, Grace. You cannot stay where you are. Not after he's shown what he's capable of. When the court rules in your favor, sell the property and leave Cedar Rapids. Don't look back. The next lines were written in smaller script, as if Eleanor's hand had trembled. There's a man in Davenport named Harold Pierce. We were close once. A long time ago. He owes me a kindness and knows what to do. He'll help you find a small workshop and a home for you and Liam. I've arranged everything quietly through him. He's expecting you. Grace wiped her face with her sleeve. She could barely read the rest through the blur of tears. I couldn't save my own son from himself. Ryan is his father's son in every way. But I can save you. You have a good heart, Grace. Protect it. And protect that boy. When you stand on your own 2 feet, no one will ever frighten you again. Her hand covered her mouth as a sob broke free, the first sound she'd made in hours. She pressed the letter to her chest, her shoulders shaking. For so long she had felt invisible, treated as a burden in her own home, tolerated rather than loved. Yet here, in black ink and fading lavender perfume, was proof that someone had seen her worth all along. Liam stirred softly in his crib, the tiny rhythm of his breathing anchoring her back to the moment. She rose, walked to him, and brushed her fingers through his dark curls. We're leaving, baby, she whispered. Grandma made sure of it. By midnight, her suitcase was open on the bed. She folded clothes in silence, careful not to wake the baby. She packed the letter first, then the small family photo that Eleanor had framed for her the previous Christmas. The keys to the house sat on the counter, a symbol of everything that was no longer hers, and yet, in a way, still was. When the rain eased, she bundled Liam into his carrier and stepped out into the cool night. The streetlights glowed faintly on the wet asphalt. She didn't know where she was going, not really. Only that somewhere in Davenport, a stranger named Harold Pierce was waiting, and that for the first time in a long while, her life belonged to her again. Behind her, the house stood dark and silent. Ahead, a new chapter, uncertain, fragile, but hers, waited beneath the endless Midwestern sky. The town was asleep when Grace stepped out into the damp night, the air heavy with the scent of rain and cooling asphalt. Streetlights flickered over rows of dark houses as she stood on the curb, clutching Liam's carrier to her chest. A yellow taxi rolled to a stop in front of her, headlights slicing through the mist. The driver leaned out, his voice low but warm. Grace Bennett. She nodded. Yes, you must be Jack Miller. That's me, he said, stepping out quickly to open the trunk. Let me help you with those bags. Grace hesitated for a moment before handing them over. Jack's movements were calm, unhurried, the kind that made people feel safe without knowing why. Once everything was loaded, he opened the back door for her and waited until she and the baby were settled before pulling away from the curb. The city lights faded fast, replaced by long stretches of empty highway and fields glistening under the moonlight. Liam slept soundly, his tiny breath soft against her shoulder. Jack glanced at them through the rearview mirror once or twice, but said nothing until they were well outside Cedar Rapids. Heading far? He finally asked. Davenport, she said quietly. He nodded, eyes still on the road. Good place. My sister went to school there. Quieter than this side of Iowa. Grace managed a faint smile. That's what I'm hoping for. He didn't pry. Didn't ask the kind of questions people usually did when they saw a woman traveling alone with a baby in the middle of the night. The hum of the tires filled the silence instead, steady, almost soothing. 2 hours later, as they entered the outskirts of Davenport, the landscape softened into small houses and tree-lined streets. The rain had stopped, and a thin layer of fog hovered over the ground. Jack slowed the car as Grace checked the address scribbled on the letter Eleanor had left her. "It should be just past the church," she murmured. They turned onto a gravel road where an old wooden house stood beneath a porch light. A man waited outside, wrapped in a heavy sweater despite the mild air. When he saw the taxi, he straightened, eyes narrowing in recognition. Jack stopped the car. "Looks like someone was expecting you," he said gently. Grace's throat tightened. She unbuckled Liam, stepped out, and thanked Jack. He lifted her suitcase from the trunk and set it beside her. "You take care, all right? Roads get lonely out here. But the people, they're good." He handed her a small card. "If you ever need a ride, any time." She smiled, whispering, "Thank you." As the taxi disappeared down the road, the older man approached. "You must be Grace," he said, voice steady, kind. "I'm Harold Pierce. Eleanor told me you'd come one day." Grace exhaled, her tension unraveling like thread pulled loose. She looked at the house, its windows glowing with a soft, golden light. Harold stepped aside and motioned toward the door. "Come in, child," he said. "You've had a long night." And as Grace crossed the threshold, the fear she'd carried from Cedar Rapids slipped quietly behind her, replaced by something she hadn't felt in years: safety. Morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, spreading across the worn wooden table where a pot of coffee steamed. Grace sat quietly, watching Harold slice a loaf of bread with slow, practiced hands. The house smelled of cedar and lavender soap, a scent that somehow reminded her of Eleanor. After breakfast, Harold led her across the yard to the small building behind the house. Its sign, faded with age, read Eleanor's Carpets. Inside, rolls of patterned fabric leaned against the walls, and the air carried the faint sweetness of wool and dye. "She started this years ago," Harold said softly, "back when she still wrote to me." His eyes drifted to the window, then back to Grace. She wanted it to stay alive. And now, maybe it can. Grace traced her fingers along the edge of a half-finished rug, feeling the texture of hand-woven fibers. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "It'll be yours to run when you're ready. But for now, there's someone I want you to meet." Inside the house, a woman was arranging flowers in a glass vase, gray hair pulled into a bun, bright eyes that softened the moment she saw the baby. "This must be Liam," she exclaimed, voice gentle but full of life. "And you're Grace." "This is my sister, Susan," Harold said. "She used to teach kindergarten, and she still misses it." Susan laughed, wiping her hands on her apron. "That's true. I can't resist babies." She reached out, and Liam instantly leaned toward her, fascinated by her necklace that caught the sunlight. "We'll get along just fine, won't we?" she murmured, rocking him slightly. For the first time in months, Grace's shoulders eased. It was such a simple moment, an older woman holding her child, yet it carried a tenderness she hadn't known she was starving for. That afternoon, she began helping in the workshop. Harold showed her how to stretch fabric, trim threads, and mix dyes. The work was rhythmic, almost meditative. Her hands learned quickly, guided by quiet patience rather than fear of mistakes. By evening, the workshop's warm light spilled out into the yard, and laughter drifted through the open door. Susan singing softly to Liam while Grace swept the floor. Days slipped by gently. Grace began to feel the ache of her old life dull into something distant, almost bearable. The nightmares that once jolted her awake grew less frequent. At dinner, Harold told stories of the small town, the harvest festivals, the stubborn mailman, the winters that froze the river into glass. And sometimes, when dusk settled over the fields, a familiar sound rolled up the gravel driveway, the low hum of a taxi. Jack would appear at the door, leaning on the frame with that easy smile. "Just checking in," he'd say. Sometimes he brought groceries, sometimes nothing at all. but he always stayed long enough to fix a leaky pipe or carry heavy fabric rolls without being asked. Grace never said it out loud, but every time he left, she caught herself looking out the window a little longer than before. A month passed, marked by quiet work and evenings filled with the hum of the sewing machine. The workshop had become Grace's refuge. The rhythmic sound of stitching replaced the anxious beating of her heart. One morning, as sunlight spilled across the counter, a letter arrived in the mail, its seal from the Cedar Rapids County Court. Grace didn't have to open it to know what it was. The date for the divorce hearing had been set. She folded the notice neatly and placed it back into the envelope, her hand steady. When Harold entered the room, wiping dust from his sleeves, she handed it to him without a word. He scanned the paper, then met her eyes. "You're ready," he said simply. That night, over dinner, Harold announced that he'd drive her to Cedar Rapids himself. Jack, seated across from them, looked up from his plate. "You shouldn't have to walk in there alone," he said, voice firm but kind. Susan reached across the table and squeezed Grace's hand. "And remember, darling," she whispered, "don't you dare bow your head. You've already stood taller than most." The morning of the hearing dawned cold and gray. They left early, the car headlights cutting through the mist. Liam stayed behind with Susan, who waved from the porch until they disappeared down the road. Cedar Rapids looked different now, or maybe Grace did. The same streets that had once felt suffocating seemed smaller, almost harmless. Harold parked near the courthouse, and as Grace stepped out, the sharp click of her heels echoed against the stone steps. She wore a navy coat and simple pearl earrings, nothing extravagant, but everything about her spoke of quiet composure. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with the low murmur of other cases. Grace sat near the back of the courtroom, waiting for her name to be called. She didn't look toward the door when it opened, but she felt it, the shift in the air, the sudden hush. Ryan Bennett had arrived. He looked older, though barely a month had passed. The confident swagger he once wore had turned stiff, his suit wrinkled, eyes shadowed from too many sleepless nights. Amber wasn't with him. Word around town, whispered through suppliers and mutual contacts, was that she'd taken a break, leaving him to face the fallout of his collapsing business alone. When he finally saw Grace, his expression faltered. He blinked as if unsure she was real. The woman standing before him wasn't the one he'd left behind in tears. Her posture was straight, her chin lifted, and her eyes calm. Steady, met his without flinching. The bailiff called their case number. Grace rose first, smoothing the lapel of her coat. Harold placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Jack lingered near the doorway, a silent guard. Ryan swallowed hard. For a fleeting moment, he seemed to realize what he had lost. Not the house, not the money, but the one person who had ever looked at him with faith. As Grace walked toward the judge's bench, the faint scent of Eleanor's lavender perfume seemed to follow her, a reminder that she wasn't walking in alone. The courtroom felt colder than Grace expected, not from the air conditioning, but from the weight of so many watching eyes. The judge sat high behind the bench, spectacles glinting under the fluorescent lights, his expression unreadable. Grace stood beside Harold, hands folded neatly, while Ryan fidgeted across the aisle. He kept checking his watch, tapping his foot, the picture of a man who couldn't believe his world was no longer bending his way. Harold leaned slightly toward her and whispered, "Remember what Eleanor said. Truth doesn't need to shout." She nodded, eyes fixed ahead. The clerk began, reading the case number and confirming both parties' presence. Ryan's voice was curt when he answered, "Yes, Your Honor." Grace's was steady, almost soft, but it carried farther than she thought it would. When the proceedings began, Ryan's attorney spoke first, a sharp, fast-talking man who treated the courtroom like a stage. "My client," he said, gesturing toward Ryan, "has rightful claim to all marital property, including the residence on Hawthorne Street. The mortgage was shared equally. The debt remains his responsibility. Harold waited patiently, letting the man finish. When the judge gave him the floor, he stepped forward with the calm precision of someone who had come prepared for battle. "Your Honor," he began, "what my client's husband failed to disclose is that the mortgage was paid in full nearly 2 years ago, not by him but by the late Mrs. Eleanor Bennet." A quiet murmur rippled through the courtroom. Ryan straightened, disbelief flickering across his face. Harold opened a folder and handed several documents to the bailiff. "Here are the certified payment receipts, signed by the lender and notarized by Mrs. Bennet herself. You'll also find a notarized deed transfer in which she names Grace Bennet as sole owner of the property." The judge studied the papers for a long moment before looking. Over his glasses, "Mr. Bennet, were you aware of these transactions?" Ryan's jaw tightened. "No, sir, I was not." "That much is obvious," Harold murmured under his breath. Ryan's lawyer tried to object, claiming the documents might be forged, but the judge silenced him with a single glance. "These are legally binding and authenticated. Unless you have evidence to the contrary, I see no grounds to dispute ownership." The gavel came down once, firm and final. "The property on Hawthorne Street is hereby awarded to Grace Bennet. The court recognizes her as the rightful owner." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. For a second, no one moved. Then Ryan exploded. "What? That's insane. She can't just take everything." He turned toward Grace, his voice cracking. "You don't deserve that house. Or the workshop, none of it." He took a step forward, but before he could cross the aisle, Jack moved from his seat near the door, blocking his path with quiet authority. "Don't," he said evenly. The single word was enough. Ryan froze, breathing hard, fury spilling out of him like heat. And then, from the back of the room, a new voice cut through the tension. Smooth, cold, unmistakably feminine. "You're on your own, Ryan." Amber stood in the doorway, her purse slung over her shoulder, sunglasses in hand. "I didn't sign up for this mess," she said flatly. "Good luck fixing it." With that, she turned and walked out, the sharp click of her heels echoing down the hallway until the sound disappeared entirely. Ryan slumped into his chair, the fight draining out of him. The courtroom fell silent again. Harold gathered the papers, slipped them into his briefcase, and turned to Grace. "It's done," he said softly. Grace exhaled, her hands unclenching for the first time all morning. She looked toward the window where sunlight filtered through the blinds, cutting thin stripes across the floor. When she left the courtroom, she didn't look back. There was no satisfaction in her step, no trace of gloating, only a quiet dignity, the kind that didn't need an audience, the kind that left its mark not through victory, but through grace itself. When Grace returned to Davenport, the sky seemed wider, the air lighter. The court ruling had ended one chapter, but what followed was something entirely new, the quiet labor of rebuilding. She sold the old house in Cedar Rapids within weeks, the funds enough to clear her debts and invest in what mattered most, the workshop that had become her second home. Harold helped her through every detail. He explained the paperwork for business ownership, guided her through state registration forms, and made sure every legal signature was exactly where it needed to be. "You'll thank me when the tax forms come," he joked, though the pride in his eyes was unmistakable. Jack spent most evenings at the shop after his taxi shifts, sleeves rolled up, chalk lines on his forearms. He drafted floor layouts on scrap paper, calculating how many looms they could fit if they moved the cutting tables closer to the window. "If we open up this wall," he said one night, "you could add 2 more workstations by next season." Grace nodded, quietly amazed by his mix of patience and certainty. He never pushed, never claimed credit. He just showed up and stayed until the work was done. They named the growing business Eleanor's Rugs, keeping the original hand-painted sign, but polishing the gold letters until they shone again. Harold handled the paperwork at City Hall, while Grace focused on production. She hired 2 women from the neighborhood, both single mothers looking for work that let them be home in time for dinner. The workshop filled with the hum of conversation, the scrape of scissors, the warm scent of dyed wool drying in the sun. By autumn, customers began coming in from other towns. Word spread that Eleanor's Rugs wasn't just another repair shop. It was a place where every piece was restored with care, where the owner remembered people's names and stories. Grace often stood by the counter with a gentle smile, listening to clients talk about family heirlooms and old memories woven into the carpets they brought. She treated each one as if it were her own. One afternoon, a woman picked up a finished rug and said softly, "You can feel the heart in this work." Grace smiled, but something in her chest tightened, not from sadness, but from gratitude. It had taken her months to find this version of herself. Steady, calm, alive. As the sun set behind the workshop windows, Jack leaned against the doorway, watching her tidy the counter. "You realize you've built something real here, right?" he said. Grace looked around, at the looms, the shelves, the laughter from the back room. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was trying to prove anything. "I think," she said softly, "I finally know what home feels like." Cedar Rapids had grown quieter for Ryan Bennett, not because the city had changed, but because no one wanted to answer his calls anymore. The workshop that once carried his name now sat half empty. Shelves were bare, machinery silent. One by one, his employees had left, taking with them whatever dignity the place still had. Suppliers refused to extend credit, and the bank called twice a week asking about overdue payments. The empire he'd built on arrogance was crumbling, and Ryan could feel it in the air every morning. He unlocked the door. The thick, stale weight of failure. He spent long nights hunched over his desk, flipping through invoices, searching for something that could save him. That was when he heard it, a rumor from one of his few remaining contacts. "There's a place in Davenport," the man said. "A carpet workshop run by some woman. Fast growth, clean reputation. Might even buy you out if the price is right." Ryan scoffed at first, but the more he thought about it, the more the idea gnawed at him. If he could sell his failing business to this small-town operation, he might salvage enough money to start again, maybe even prove to everyone that he could still come out on top. 2 days later, he drove to Davenport. The closer he got, the more his confidence faltered. The roads were lined with small houses, neatly painted, with flower beds and trimmed lawns, nothing like the chaos his life had become. When he finally reached the address, he stopped the car and stared. The sign above the door read Eleanor's Rugs in polished gold letters. Something inside him twisted. Eleanor, his mother's name. He almost turned back, but pride pushed him forward. Inside, the workshop was bright, filled with sunlight and the faint scent of dye. People worked quietly at large tables, laughter mingling with the hum of sewing machines. Ryan approached the front office, rehearsing his pitch until the woman behind the desk looked up. His words died in his throat. Grace sat there, composed, steady, her hands folded on the desk like she'd been expecting him all along. The light from the window touched her hair, catching the gold tones he'd never noticed before. She looked nothing like the woman he once dismissed. He swallowed hard. "Grace." Her voice was calm, almost detached. "If you're here to make a business offer, please go ahead. But if you're here to revisit the past," her eyes met his, unwavering, "I don't have the time." Ryan's mouth opened, then closed again. He couldn't find a single word that didn't sound hollow. Around them, the workshop kept moving, laughter, footsteps, the steady rhythm of life continuing without him. He gave a short, bitter laugh and nodded. "Of course you don't." Then he turned and walked out, the doorbell chiming softly behind him. Outside, the afternoon sun glared off the windshield of his car, forcing him to squint. For the first time in his life, Ryan Bennett felt the full weight of defeat, not the kind that comes from losing money or reputation, but the kind that strips away the illusion of control. He sat behind the wheel for a long time, staring at the gold letters on the building across the street, realizing too late that Grace hadn't taken his fortune. She had simply reclaimed her own. The sun was beginning to fade when Jack's truck pulled into the gravel driveway, its headlights cutting a narrow path through the golden dust of late afternoon. Inside the workshop, the day's work was nearly done. The looms stood silent. The scent of wool and soap lingered in the air, and the faint laughter of the workers drifted away as they locked up for the evening. Grace stood by the counter, sorting through receipts, her sleeves rolled up and a faint streak of dye still on her wrist. Jack leaned against the doorway, watching her for a moment before speaking. "You never stop," he said, his voice gentle. Grace looked up, smiling softly. "It's easier to keep going than to stop." He walked closer, setting a box down on the counter, a shipment of freshly dyed threads from the supplier. "Delivery's done. The roads are clear. And while I was driving," he said, his tone shifting, "I was thinking about something." Grace raised an eyebrow. "That sounds serious." Jack smiled faintly. "Maybe it is. You remember the old workshop in Cedar Rapids? The one Eleanor started before she moved everything here." She nodded slowly, the building's still standing, though it's been empty for years. "I was thinking," he continued, "we could bring it back. Not as a business, not for profit, but as a training place. For women who want to learn the craft. People like you once were, starting over, looking for something steady." Grace stared at him, speechless for a moment. The idea hit her with quiet force, simple, beautiful, and exactly what Eleanor would have done. "You'd really want to do that?" she asked softly. Jack shrugged, his usual easy smile returning. "I think it's what your mother-in-law would have wanted, and I think it's what you'd want too." She turned away briefly, blinking against the emotion rising in her chest. "It's more than I could have imagined," she whispered. Jack rested his hands on the counter, his gaze steady on hers. "Grace, if you say yes, I'll start tomorrow. I'll fix that roof, clean up the machines, paint the walls, whatever it takes. I just want to see it alive again." For a long moment, neither spoke. The light through the window turned amber, softening the edges of everything it touched. Grace looked at him, truly looked, at the man who had stood by her quietly, never asking for anything in return. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you say you'll do it, Jack, I believe you will." He smiled, not the grin of a man who'd won something, but the look of someone who'd finally found where he was meant to be. Outside, the last light of day faded behind the fields. Inside, the warmth lingered, two people no longer running from the past, standing side by side in the promise of something new. A full year had passed, and the old brick building in Cedar Rapids no longer stood in silence. The broken windows had been replaced, the walls freshly painted in warm cream, and a new wooden sign hung above the entrance, carved with elegant letters that read, "Eleanor's Legacy Workshop." Beneath it, a smaller line gleamed in gold. "For every woman who dared to begin again." The ribbon-cutting ceremony drew a small crowd, townspeople, local reporters, and a few curious faces from neighboring cities. A journalist from the Cedar Rapids Chronicle snapped photos, while scribbling notes about the woman who had revived a forgotten family business and turned it into a place of new beginnings. Grace stood near the doorway, greeting guests with quiet composure, her hands no longer trembling the way they once had. Inside, sunlight poured through the tall windows, glinting off rows of looms and polished wooden tables. The scent of freshly dyed wool mingled with the faint aroma of coffee and apple pie that Susan had baked that morning. Harold stood near the back, chatting with the mayor about the workshop's community program, while Jack adjusted a light fixture that had been bothering him all morning. He caught Grace's eye and gave her a little nod, Everything was perfect now. Liam ran across the floor, laughing as his small feet brushed over a newly woven rug. "Mommy, this one's soft," he said, his voice bright and clear. Grace knelt to touch the fabric beside him. "It's called Hope," she whispered, smiling. The crowd gathered as Harold stepped forward to say a few words. His voice carried warmth and pride. "Eleanor Bennett believed in the dignity of honest work," he said. "Today that belief lives on, not just in this building, but in the hands of everyone who will come here to learn." When he finished, he gestured toward Grace. The room filled with gentle applause. Grace glanced up at the sign again, her heart swelling with something deeper than pride. It was peace, quiet, unshakable, long overdue. She turned to Jack, who stood beside her now, the sleeves of his shirt rolled to his elbows, a faint streak of paint still on his wrist. "She'd be proud," Grace said softly, her eyes glistening. Jack smiled. "She already is." As the doors opened to welcome the first students inside, Grace watched the sunlight spill across the room, touching every thread, every color, every life that would begin again under this roof. The storm that had once defined her story was gone, leaving only warmth in its wake, the calm strength of a woman who had turned pain into legacy.